The recent commentary emanating from former President Donald Trump regarding Western Europe presents a significant inflection point in transatlantic relations, potentially signaling a dramatic shift in diplomatic engagement should he return to office. This is not merely campaign rhetoric, it is a calculated broadside that deserves careful, cautious scrutiny.
The context of these remarks, primarily detailed in an interview published by Politico on December 9th, sets the stage for what appears to be a systemic critique of contemporary European leadership and policy efficacy. The language employed by Mr. Trump was notably uncompromising, describing Western European nations collectively as a collection of failing states led by inherently weak figures.
This choice of terminology is highly deliberate, crafted perhaps to resonate both with his domestic base, which often views allied dependency as a financial burden, and to apply maximum psychological pressure on Brussels. It is plausible that the timing of this intervention, amidst ongoing geopolitical instability and the intensifying U.S. primary season, was strategically chosen to maximize impact.
His central indictment rests on two pillars: the alleged mishandling of the migration crisis and Europe's purported insufficient commitment to resolving the conflict in Ukraine. Regarding the former, Mr. Trump asserted that Europe's current migration policies are actively pushing several countries to the brink of collapse, claiming that unchecked, unvetted, and undeported illegal entrants are eroding national stability.
This perspective, while politically potent in many European capitals facing internal populist pressures, risks overlooking the intricate legal and humanitarian frameworks that govern asylum and border management within the Schengen area, systems that, while imperfect, are fundamentally different from the U.S. approach. One might infer that this focus on migration serves a dual purpose: to validate his own past and potential future immigration policies, and to implicitly criticize what he perceives as a failure of sovereignty among U.S. allies. He suggested that Western European leaders talk too much regarding peace negotiations, implying a lack of decisive action or strategic clarity. Crucially, however, he offered a carefully hedged concession. If these European leaders genuinely believe Kyiv can achieve victory, they are free to continue their support as long as they like.
This particular statement is ripe for interpretation. It is likely an attempt to project an image of non-interventionist pragmatism while simultaneously distancing himself from the substantial financial and military commitments made by NATO and the EU to date. The underlying message, however, seems to suggest that European involvement is largely performative, or at best, ineffective in charting a definitive path to peace.
Beyond the specific policy critiques, the former president offered a broader, structural assessment of the Western European political class, describing it as fundamentally ineffective and overly constrained by what he termed political face. This phrase appears to be a veiled criticism of multilateralism and consensus-driven decision-making, hallmarks of the EU system. He stated plainly, "I think they are weak," adding that Europe seems confused and unsure of its next steps. Such characterizations, delivered by a major political figure potentially weeks away from securing the nomination of a major party, inevitably send tremors through diplomatic channels, compelling leaders to reassess the long-term reliability of the U.S. security guarantee. The subsequent reaction from Brussels demonstrates the immediate tension these statements have engendered. In parallel with the Politico interview, Mr. Trump had also expressed strong disapproval of the European Union's decision to heavily fine Elon Musk's social media platform X approximately $140 million, citing violations of digital content rules. Speaking at the White House on December 8th, Mr. Trump characterized the EU alliance itself as going badly, framing the fine against X as an instance of regulatory overreach or perhaps a suppression of free expression. This combination of critiques targeting geopolitical failures, migration policies, and digital regulation painted a holistic picture of an EU system in decline. The official European response was swift, measured, yet distinctly pointed. High-level representatives, such as the EU's senior official for foreign affairs and security policy, reacted publicly, suggesting that these recent criticisms from Mr.
Trump and certain other U.S. officials constituted a deliberate provocation designed specifically to elicit a reactive or defensive posture from the EU. It is important to acknowledge that this interpretation implies a strategic calculus on Washington's part, where the goal might be less about offering constructive critique and more about sowing discord or extracting concessions.
The EU response firmly defended the Union's foundational values, emphasizing that the European Union itself embodies the very essence of freedom. Furthermore, the EU official redirected the moral compass of the critique, pointedly suggesting that any criticisms regarding global destabilization ought to be aimed squarely at Russia, not at the transatlantic allies.
This counterargument effectively sought to reframe the debate, asserting that the focus on internal European shortcomings distracts from the primary geopolitical threat facing the West. In summarizing the immediate context, these pronouncements are significant not merely for their severity, but because they highlight the fragility of the Washington-Brussels relationship since Mr. Trump first assumed the presidency in 2017.
Even during periods of relative détente, underlying disputes over trade tariffs, proportionate defense spending within NATO, and digital regulatory standards have consistently created friction. Should the political landscape shift again in 2025, one must anticipate that these current criticisms will form the bedrock of a renegotiated and likely more adversarial relationship.
It is reasonable to hypothesize that the overarching challenge for European leaders will be navigating a U.S. administration that seems determined to treat its allies not as partners in a shared global project, but as competing entities whose primary purpose should be to serve immediate American interests, thereby demanding a fundamental strategic adjustment in Europe's approach to security, trade, and sovereignty.
The current episode serves as an unequivocal early warning signal of the intensity of the political headwinds that lie ahead. The intensity of the political headwinds signaled by Washington's evolving strategic doctrine leads inevitably to a closer examination of the specific charges leveled against its traditional transatlantic partners, charges which define the scope of the coming conflict.
At the core of the recent commentary lies the highly inflammatory assessment that Western Europe is characterized by decline, a condition purportedly caused by weak leadership, unduly constrained by political considerations, or what was dismissively termed political face. This assessment, articulated by the former president, suggests a fundamental misreading, or perhaps a deliberate dismissal of the complexities inherent in multi-state governance.
It is likely that this critique is intended to erode confidence in the European project itself, framing multilateral consensus building, the very nature of the European Union, not as strength, but as crippling indecisiveness. While European internal political dynamics are certainly characterized by periods of slow response and often challenging compromise, the suggestion that the leaders are universally weak seems primarily designed as a political rhetorical tool to justify future unilateral American policy shifts. The underlying argument here is that a continent lacking self-direction cannot object when its most powerful ally redefines the terms of engagement. One hypothesis is that this focus on weakness serves to preemptively dismiss any future European resistance to shifts in trade policy, defense burden sharing, or foreign policy alignment, such as those related to China. The former president's remarks extended dramatically to the highly sensitive issue of European migration policy, asserting that current policies are rapidly pushing certain nations toward collapse by permitting large, unvetted, and uncontrolled entries, coupled with a lack of systematic deportation for those entering unlawfully. This is a charged political narrative that resonates powerfully with specific domestic American political constituencies, and its projection onto the European landscape is instructive. It would appear to conflate the diverse, often contradictory migration policies across the continent, ranging from highly restrictive to more accommodative, into a singular failure narrative.
While managing large-scale migration flows certainly presents profound societal and logistical challenges, evidenced by recent European efforts toward reform, the apocalyptic language used suggests a rhetorical linkage between national sovereignty and border control that places it among the highest priorities for the prospective White House administration,
thereby setting the stage for significant policy friction with Brussels and individual capitals regarding border enforcement cooperation and internal security structures. Further complicating the security relationship is the critical analysis directed toward Europe's role in the Ukraine conflict. The assertion that European leaders talk too much and should stop supporting Kiev if they genuinely believe victory is unattainable speaks to a desire for clear, immediate strategic outcomes rather than sustained political and economic deterrence. Europe's contribution, while perhaps perceived by some in Washington as insufficient, encompasses not only substantial financial aid, but also the long-term logistical and political infrastructure necessary to sustain the war effort. The reluctance across certain European quarters to greenlight certain aggressive military steps often reflects complex internal political calculations and a profound concern regarding escalation risk with Russia, rather than mere weakness.
Should the administration seek a rapid, negotiated end to the conflict, a goal suggested by the statement that European leaders are free to continue supporting Kiev if they truly believe victory is possible, it is highly probable that Brussels will find itself under intense pressure to alter its long-term commitment strategy, potentially leading to deep fissures within the NATO alliance regarding the future security architecture of Eastern Europe. Crucially, the friction is not limited to security and migration, but extends into the realm of digital regulation and global economic governance, underscored by the public support offered to Elon Musk's social media platform X, following the $140 million fine levied by the EU under the Digital Services Act. The former president's critique that the European Union is moving in a bad direction by heavily penalizing X implies a deep philosophical opposition to the EU's attempts at regulatory sovereignty over big tech. For the EU, the DSA represents a critical step in safeguarding democracy and citizens against online harms and misinformation. It is viewed as a necessary defense of digital public space. Conversely, the incoming American perspective appears to interpret such stringent regulation as burdensome governmental overreach that stifles innovation and freedom of expression. This particular controversy signals that digital policy, trade disputes, and technology regulation are likely to become as contentious as traditional security matters, intensifying the existing rifts that have marred Washington-Brussels relations regarding technology standards and data flows since 2025. In response to these multi-layered criticisms, the European Union's reaction, specifically through its High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, views these critiques as deliberate provocations designed to compel a reaction, effectively seeking to destabilize the political landscape. By firmly asserting that the EU embodies freedom and redirecting criticism toward Russia, Europe is attempting to pivot the conversation back to shared values and security threats.
However, this response does not resolve the fundamental issue. The relationship between Washington and Brussels, once rooted in a shared post-war liberal order, has devolved into a transactional partnership built on conflicting priorities regarding defense spending, trade barriers, and differing regulatory philosophies.
The open loop of the new transatlantic friction is therefore closed by the realization that the relationship will remain structurally difficult, characterized by constant policy skirmishes. The overarching conclusion derived from this series of pointed criticisms is that Europe must now definitively plan for a future where American diplomatic engagement is primarily conditional and transactional, requiring a fundamental shift toward genuine strategic autonomy across security, technological, and economic domains.
While these analyses provide critical context regarding potential policy trajectories, it is prudent to reiterate that the commentary and insights presented herein are solely based on publicly available information and represent the channel's own independent perspective, offered strictly for informational and analytical purposes.